Our property purchase fell through in 2021, and the 6-month delay gave us an extra 50 bips off the mortgage rate by the time we got around to doing it again. So that was quite nice as well.
That's pretty good, isn't it? 4.0. Would you say it was
4.08 buy to let?
And what loans of value do you have to have?
It's
So like 60.
I can go up to 65, but I'm not doing that. It's you're up to 65%.
And what do you think? What's the yield?
Oh, it's awful. So it's in central London. It's it's a £500,000 flat, and it produces 2,100 a month. And so, not very much, is it?
That's the problem on resi in London.
It just doesn't make any sense. Just I've owned it for a while and I can't sell it, and I'll leave it alone.
I've got a client who's got a place in Fleet, a running yield, and that's the best part of 10%. It was 150 grand flat, but still,
exactly.
it's over £1,000 a month net.
Yeah.
So I guess if you go to, if you're not in central London, there's probably yield to be had, right?
Yeah,
but I mean, we see a lot of clients kind of fleeing from the buy-to-let market. Is that obvious from above, or is that just us in our little bubble of who we talk to?
No, I think that's right. I think that's what so it's not something I particularly cover, but that appears to be what is being said by many. That people have just had enough. The operational cost of these things too hard. Why bother? Pick the market. What's the tax treatment going to be after the budget? Don't know.
I'm hoping we can get through all of this without talking about the budget. I fear we might not.
Property and budget. There's no way we're not getting through without a budget.
Well, hopefully we'll get this out before the budget.
Yeah. We good to go, Alex?
Yeah. Good. Okay.
Star producer.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Taking Stock After the Bell, episode 40, I believe. Well done, Husey. You made it to 40. We are today delighted to be joined by Andrew Allen. Andrew, good afternoon. By way of background, Andrew is the Global Chief Investment Officer at Savills Investment Management, where he joined in 2021. He is a member of the Global Executive Committee and chairs the New Business Committee. Before joining Savills, Andrew was Global Head of Investment Research Real Estate at Aberdeen Standard Investments, where he led the Global Property Research and Strategy team. Andrew's academic background includes a bachelor's degree in economics and business finance from Brunel University and a master's degree in property investment from City University. Throughout his career, Andrew has held various roles in real estate research and strategy, contributing significantly to the field. So says Microsoft Copilot, which has written that for us.
That sounds like it must be true.
It must be true. I mean, the machines are right. Andrew, welcome. Good afternoon to you.
Thank you.
We thought that we could get you on to have a sort of perspective on real estate in general, property, and not just kind of, houses, but across the sectors. So we've got a few sort of, areas we'd like to kind of delve into. But we've got a couple of charts that we'd sort of run through. The first one here, we were being somewhat facetious at the opening in terms of time horizons, because as some of you know, every fund manager just changes the start date to suit the narrative. So here we've got a 30-year chart of global equities in blue against the main two UK residential property indices. So this is the nationwide in grey and the Halifax House Price Index in yellow. And the red line is the cumulative impact of CPI. As I said, over the 30-year period, inflation has basically meant the prices have doubled in that time. Equities are up 6.5 times, and residential properties up 5 times. So it's been an interesting journey. And any sort of thoughts on that, high-level thoughts in terms of how property has done, residential property in particular, as an asset class over that time frame?
I guess the main thing to say about residential in the UK is that it just isn't adequately supplied. So there is a critical shortfall of housing, which the current government have been very public about. The consequence of that is that we have seen pretty strong appreciation in capital values over a long period of time. You have another chart here which looks at the level of housing completions, which probably helps illustrate the point that you first made. If you go back in time, so let's think about what the government's currently saying. They are saying that they would like, they will have built something like 1.5 million houses, dwellings over a 5-year period. that's thereabouts 300,000 units a year. We think that's a very laudable ambition, but against recent history, indeed back to my childhood, it's improbable.
So those listening, got the chart here of UK housing completions going back to 1950, and it also splits it out. The red bars presumably are government house building.
Yeah, so it's the bars show the point that I think is very topical right now in terms of another government announcement, which is about the level of investment that might go into what used to be called council housing, public housing. And that is, so the government announcement, I think, which is yesterday, is of thereabouts an extra £1 billion going into that market. And then I think what's helpful is to put some context around this. So again, that's clearly helpful. It's very ambitious. But if an average house is worth, say, £250,000, that's 4,000 residential units. I don't think most people are going to notice.
No.
The housing shortfall has, it's only in the late 60s, 70s when there was a very high level of public house building, the high public house building program, did we reach 300,000 units. And then there's lots of industry commentators talking about housing. There is a positive coming, by the way. The housing issue really is about capacity of the UK to build housing. The public statements are about the difficulty with planning controls and those kind of issues, but realistically, the capacity of the land that we have available, the political tensions around that, but also just the infrastructure that is required to get houses built. 1.5 million heating systems, the bricks that are required, the labourers who build the houses. We've recently seen that modular construction, so modern methods of construction, so those kind of houses haven't really caught hold in the UK. We don't have an industrial way of building houses at scale in the UK.
Is there a case that, I'm a sort of firm believer in kind of market economics. If you incentivize people through the market mechanism, whether that's paying brickies a few more quid or getting the companies who make the bricks to invest a bit more in a few more factories to make some more bricks. Does it happen over a 5 to 10 year period? Granted, not on a 6 to 12 month time horizon, but is it possible that we get back to the halcyon days? Let's not talk about the 60s and halcyon days. But is it possible to get back to the days of building 300,000 houses a year like we clearly need to do?
One would expect it to start to work, yes. The government policies about being pro-building, one would expect that to start to loosen up the sites that are sometimes called sort of grey belt. There's plenty of land that can be built upon. We have capacity challenges, you've said about the brickies and the people who are actually putting the houses up. But I think it is realistic to say that the house builders want to get these things built. They're not sitting on their hands holding back. But there's an awful lot to do. And it gets worse, better, depending which way you look at it, because the housing quality that we have in the UK, the houses are quite old. They're not as energy efficient as they need to be. And we have a demographic issue, which is that the household sizes of the UK, which I guess you've spoken about on other versions of this, we have demographic effects.
Yes.
So we have more people living singularly for longer. So the housing
fewer
stock,
people per houses. So you need more houses for your
or more housing
population.
units. Yeah, exactly. And
actually, there was talk of that single occupancy sort of benefits being removed, wasn't there, in the budget? Actually, I promised not to talk about the budget, but there was.
That's £20 in the pot.
Yeah, I know.
So that sounds like a negative, but I think for your client base, I think it's interesting because everything else being equal, that would suggest that there is no chance that the UK is going to supply itself with the right kind of housing anytime soon. So that would suggest that the values of the investments that they have, everything else being equal, should hold up quite well.
Particularly in the southeast, right?
Yeah,
We've probably got the most acute shortage. I would think. I don't know.
Well, the shortage is the occupation of rental properties. It's very high across the regions. You don't tend to see it politically. You tend to see people talking about empty houses, but it's really very small. And so, just to give this some context, the commercial property market, the vacancy rate in residential is the fraction of nothing compared to what one might see in an average high street for unit shops or offices, as an example.
And is the housing not being built because there's not enough builders, there's not enough investors, there's not the appetite from people, or is housing just too expensive, or is all of the above?
It's a quite a high margin business for a house builder, right? To build a house, isn't it? 20-30% profit margin? Pass. You think that they're not doing it out of the goodness of their own heart. If you're Persimmon or Taylor Wimpey or whatever, if you're building a house on a plot of land, you're going to make some decent money out of that.
Yes, they should do. Is it absence of investors? I think we need to split the conversation between single housing acquisition by a buy-to-let type investor versus what you may or may not be watching, but the institutional capital is rising very rapidly towards the delivery of housing without any question. And the UK
is that UK investors or is that international?
It's both. If you had just an institutional property portfolio as measured by MSCI, then the history of the last 20-30 years, so since the 80s, most institutions in the UK have not really explored residential. That changed in the late 90s, early 2000s when they started exploring the purpose-built student accommodation market, meaning student halls. And that's now a very mature market here. It's very, very well developed. Lots of operators that are very reliable, very clear model as to how that all works. But in terms of renting to individuals, so that might, in a US sense, that's called multi-family housing. So that's a block of flats designed with rent in mind. So it's like student halls for grown-ups. Those blocks, if you were in the US and that you were like a state pension plan, something like that, that would probably be the highest allocation you have within real estate. Right. Okay. But in the UK, it's not something that we've typically seen. In Germany, it's very high. In Sweden, it's high. In the Netherlands, it's really high. So we strongly expect there to be a very high level of institutionalization, effectively, professionalization of the rental market. And this becomes a bit, potentially sort of touches on politics again, because the UK government, the Conservative government recognised this and the Labour government recognised this, that the institutions are there to potentially help create the housing stock. So they potentially are there. The surveys we did Savills and Savills IM, who I work for, did a survey last year. The Capital wants to do this. There are other surveys by organisations like Property Market Analysis, INREV. They all point to the same thing. So there's a real shift here.
And is lack of land or sort of, is that the big barrier to getting development going, or is it? I know town planning.
The planning, that's been
really difficult.
Yeah, then the number of planning officers has dropped like a stone in the public sector. So the government have put an initiative to put people back into that. The available land, there is land that could be developed, but of course for large format housing developments, then that tends to concern people who live near those things. So that tends to slow the programme down.
NIMBYism is a thing.
NIMBYism is a big thing.
Is it sort of if you look at the southeast, the Tory government, one could argue the Tory government struggled to get houses built in the southeast because their local MPs were in the constituencies that were likely to get more built on. Labour don't have that problem, in inverted commas, because they don't have those constituencies. So you might think that Angela Rayner, who's in charge of the Deputy Prime Minister, isn't she? She'd be more happy to kind of step all over those kind of NIMBY concerns. Is that fair representation?
I think that's probably right. I live in north-west of London, very near Amersham, the Amersham-Chesham election. If you remember, that was Conservative on a housing policy. It was definitely an influence in what happened with that election. And I think you're right that the suburbs of the southeast, tend to be more conservative. So you could see a Labour government having a different position than the prior government. Yeah,
well, I'm on the just outside Wokingham, and Wokingham's, there's a lot of house building happened on the edge of Wokingham, but that's another constituency that had a strong Conservative MP, is now Liberal. Angela Rayner doesn't really care what the people of Wokingham say. She wants to build more houses, so that would be for her. If something goes up to central government on a planning application in Wokingham, she probably ticks the box, right, without too much thought, because she hasn't got an MP in her ear. I don't know. This is the politics for it.
Again, I'm not making a political comment, but the Labour win was very significant, and that gives them the position to make bold, decisive actions. Whether you agree with it or not, that's a slightly different thing.
That's politics,
But And then on the grid, National Grid have got a real issue with certain plot sizes, haven't they? They just can't supply the right amount of electricity.
Well, you're sort of walking into something else we might talk about later, which so the energy. Well, there's all sorts of infrastructure issues. So energy, water. If you following a very topical debate at the moment to talk about commercial property as well. So, as an example, data centers. So the storage. Everyone wants to buy things through using e-commerce and the AI and everything. That the information needs to be stored. Some of those are stored in data centers. The data center market creates a few challenges. So that's critical infrastructure that one would assume would need to be built, but it has enormous issues coming through what it does to your point around power usage. So to take that one stage further, we're just writing something about data centers. And one of the observations of my colleague who's been writing about this, the volume of capital that is required to build the data centers is very significant, but the volume of capital that's required to put the energy into them is equally significant. An FT article at the weekend talked about something like $178 billion worth of capital being invested in data centers globally this year, and a power requirement that's something equivalent to that of Japan each year going forwards.
Wow.
Well, I know in the US some of the tech firms are doing their own almost, is it nuclear
small modular reactors. Microsoft, Amazon, and
try and
Google
power their
have all
own
done
data
deals
centers
in the last 2 weeks.
But there's a limit, isn't there, on a housing site? You can't put more than 100 homes on a site because of National Grid issues.
I don't know the answer to that. The one of the things that one of the fundamental things that I think your client-based colleagues possibly should be thinking about is what happens as a result of population growth. So, and again, try not to. It's not a Brexit or an immigration point. The UK population is growing for reasons that either to do with the fertility rates or to do with migration, and so I promise to answer the question. What that means in a place like London is that it has grown extremely rapidly, and even if the population even if no net new people came into London, it would still grow because the population is young and full of family formers. And so to your point about the use of land, so that necessarily forces us to think about the use of land in the city that's already very built out. So the kind of words you might use is intensification. So you'll see it at places like, say, the city centre Manchester, or Wembley, or along the river Thames on the South Bank. You will see much greater intensification of the use of those plots of land, and that goes through to how we think about commercial real estate as well, because the population wants to be in the cities typically. The job prospects are better, the quality of life is often higher, and so that forces the pressure upon the land. So as a real estate strategy, buying land and not making any more
not making any more of it
has got a certain ring. I wrote something years ago called "Buy Land and Not Make It Anymore." Was Mark Twain right? And the only feedback I had was that Mark Twain probably didn't ever say that. But the point is that the urbanisation. So we see this as a huge fundamental support of real estate prices for the UK, Europe. We're undertaking a strategy in Australia which solves the same point really. So yes, you will see intensification.
Really interesting.
Moving on to one of my favourite charts there is actually, and it was in one of your notes, but I keep an eye on this quite regularly. So here's a chart of the proportion of retail sales in the UK done online, going back to 2009. So in 2009, 5% of the stuff that we bought, non-food, was done online. And pre-pandemic, that number was 15%, and you can see that trend was pretty linear. Then clearly we all sat at home and couldn't go to the shops. So the proportion of stuff that we bought online spiked to 45%, and then it was sort of volatile a couple of years. And now it's back at kind of 20, which is pretty much back to that kind of long-term trend, which I find really fascinating. Had you not had the pandemic, it would have just been quite a nice gentle gradient. So, this brings in sort of two sectors of commercial real estate, really. Clearly the first being retail, and the second being industrial. Do we want to start with retail, Andrew, and how has this impacted retail over the clearly the last decade or two, and what are the sort of prospects going forward? I don't know about you, but I'm pretty fed up of ordering shoes online and them not fitting and sending them back. I actually now want to go to a shop. So clearly, this number is we're never going to buy all of the stuff that we need online. There are going to be shops, right? It's just a case of how many shops do we need, I suppose.
My original background is retail consultancy and advice. I wrote something in 2012 called High Noon for the UK High Street, where I said that it was likely that rents would halve, and it wasn't about e-commerce. So that the story of retail is about diversion of sales away from where it used to be. So that's partly to do with e-commerce, which is your chart shows that very strong growth. One of the things to remember is quite a lot of people actually like shopping.
It's a pastime, isn't it?
It's a pastime.
Particularly for the Brits.
So that isn't very likely to go away. So some positive things to think about. The footfall, so the number of people who are active in the major town centres and city centres of the UK have been rising quite strongly. So the middle of London, the middle of Manchester, the middle of Birmingham and so on. So that has come back really strongly. But it isn't doing that in the average smaller town. And they have got real problems. And that I guess that'll be familiar to the people watching, listening, about how their town has changed in the last 20, 30 years. So there's various things going on. So we saw a rash of what we call retail parks, so out of town non-food goods. So the likes of the DIY stores and increasingly fashion stores went out of town in the 1990s. And then the supermarkets were also going out of town at that point at the same time. And we also had a huge surge of shopping centre development in the late 1990s and into the 2000s. Yeah. Then we've had e-commerce as well. So it's actually a series of things. I think our view is that e-commerce is the straw that broke the camel's back. Though it was already building up a tension, and e-commerce has triggered the final thing. You wouldn't assume. So the way to think about it is that the e-commerce is it dilutes sales. So that means there's less sales per square foot, the sales density, exactly. Yeah. And then that has an exaggerated effect on the profit density.
The rent,
So then what does the retailer do? The retailer has to push back on the rent. So it's brought the rents right down. And in many cases, so the positive of this is in many cases this has been rebased. And so there's now opportunity to get it back into that market, should people be brave enough to think about how they might own a shopping centre, which is not for the light heart, it's not, you wouldn't take a light-hearted view to that because it's going to be difficult. But the very best shopping centres, a major shopping centre is transacting about now, and it will sell quite well. Right. But it's about as good as it gets.
But what would be the valuation on that today compared to 5 or 10 years ago? You're probably down quite a lot in capital terms, aren't you?
Yeah. So I don't know how much they would.
Probably. I don't know.
I don't know is the answer. But there are plenty of shopping centres that have reduced to maybe 20% of what their value was.
Really?
Yeah. Great. But they wouldn't be the things you would necessarily associate. So then there's other elements to the retail market. So one area that, one of the things I should have said is that many investors find it quite hard to talk about the positive story to retail because of the chart you're showing about the online change. The reality is that retail is very different. There's many different ways of cutting this. So we've been in fact, one of your clients has worked within Savills IM, has been very successful with a pan-European food retail fund. So buying supermarkets across the UK and Europe. And why is that? That's because these are necessity-based goods. In many cases, the financial strength of the occupiers is really strong. So very, very high quality covenant ratings, and they sign long leases with indexation. And to take it to where you were going, they are also part of the last mile supply chain. So we would use the word omni-channel. So they're part of the getting the goods to the home. So you might click and collect, or they may be serviced from the supermarkets. So supermarkets have been very, very successful.
And they have navigated the online. We've got on the chart we've got here shows the food retail proportion as well. And again, it was 5% pre-pandemic. It went to 10. It's come back to sort of 6 or 7. Looks very similar to the Ocado share price, dare I say. But the traditional supermarkets have done a pretty good job actually of navigating you know, the Tesco's and Sainsbury's, they've worked their way through it, and they've used their existing physical footprint to be able to service their customers however they want that omni-channel
They've done other
style.
bits as well, haven't they? Because Sainsbury's bought Argos, and they sort of expanded out
Tesco
away
bought
from...
Booker.
Yeah, they've expanded out just away from food.
Yeah.
But I think also, my comment would be, you know, online grocery, I think you can end up with products that you haven't ordered. You know, we haven't got this on the shelf, so we're going to give you something slightly different.
Well, it's not a panacea, is it? For
no.
People still like to go in and pick their pick their fruit. But
yeah, I don't.
Be interesting to see how that goes.
No, and sorry, there's a demographic point. So many people aren't like us working in professional services, sitting in London. So one of the interesting aspects of this is that it works locally everywhere. So there clearly supermarkets have worked out that they should be close to their consumers. And one of the other points there, which comes back to that population growth point, is that often their underlying site values are quite high. So there's a relatively resilient land value. It won't be worth as much as the whole building.
Oh, because the residual plot is probably worth something, because you can do something else with it.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, because you've got access and you've got roads and you've got the infrastructure already in place.
Yes.
So then that makes sense.
We're pursuing a specific strategy around that in Australia. It's exactly the same story, just with more population growth. The other areas to think about, retail parks. So that means non-food goods typically. So the likes of, you know, a DIY store or maybe a Next and so on. They're very commonly found out of town, and that part of the retail market got hit really hard as people fell out of love with retail and over discounted it, in our view. And again, you have long leases to very strong financial tenants, and the tenants might not be everybody's choice of where they might shop. They might be value oriented, discount related, but those companies are very, very well run. So the likes of B&M and so on, they have done really well. It's a very compelling part of the market that's easily forgotten when people are thinking about the threat of online and the oversupply generally of the retail market.
Because interesting, Mike Ashley's been buying up retail parks, hasn't he?
And shopping centres.
Yeah.
And so he's been very active in that, but he has his own retail operation, his retail stores. Yeah. So he's got a great deal of insight in those things, and can put his own product through the shopping centres effectively in the retail parks.
So is there a bright future for the traditional high street in a sense? I mean, most high streets are sort of charity shops and coffee shops. Some of the weaker towns, perhaps weaker. I'm not sure what I phrase this, but is there a renaissance coming? Can councils do things to get people back into towns? Because as we said, it is a pastime. Yeah. We want somewhere to go. We're social creatures, right?
The answer is yes, but it will be for far fewer towns and cities. So there's a enormous consolidation into far fewer locations, and those very best locations will work. They'll be dynamic. People will enjoy shopping there, but there'll be materially fewer of them.
And the business rates and things like that play a big part as well. If the government sorted out how high we constantly hear businesses moaning about business rates, is that a big issue, or is it just that e-commerce growth is done what it's done and there's less demand from the stores?
It must be true to say if the business rates were lower, that would help some of these occupiers, but the genie's out of the bottle.
Okay.
The chart you were showing of the e-commerce growth, that isn't going backwards.
No.
And it, as you were saying earlier, that it's improbable to see it sort of 50, 60, 70. It's just not very likely that would be the case. Most shopping is done through shops, but it's this marginal erosion that damages the profitability.
Yeah. And that's just enough to push people over the edge almost.
Well,
some.
Turn it the other way around. If we were thinking we had a retail proposition in our heads and we were going to set up a business tomorrow, I don't think we'd be opening a shop.
Very true.
He used to be saying a tent at both sides, flogging lemonade. No, that's interesting. And as the chief exec of Domino's Pizza once said in a meeting that I was sat in, every day that goes by, a non-pizzeria dies and a pizzeria is born. And it's very similar to online shopping, right? As time passes, more people are used to shopping online and don't want to get like, Alex over there, Gen Z. He's not going to shops very often, is he? So
I couldn't agree. I make a point. My mother never touched a computer.
Yeah.
And my kids don't really go to shops.
There we go.
Yeah.
It's exactly the same
Passage
point.
of time, right?
And
yeah.
I
So
am
then-
also fed up with buying shoes and trousers that don't fit me online.
Well.
I also like a shop. That's showing John's age, I guess, not mine.
Moving swiftly on. If the downside of shift to online, if the casualties, if you like, are the owners of high street shops, the beneficiaries might well be sheds and warehouses, right? So we've got a chart here on two charts. We've got first left-hand side, we've got the change in population of London versus the change in the amount of industrial land in and around London. And the right-hand side, we've got a chart of property rental growth indexed back 12, 14 years, showing how London industrial, the green line, is up 100% over that time versus all property, which is only up 17%. So industrial, warehouse, logistics really are the kind of winners from online retail, right? Particularly in and around the southeast.
Yeah, exactly right. And again, there's rather like the retail conversation. There are variations here. So start with the chart on the left-hand side, which is possibly my favourite chart. So it's not too complicated. I can do this one. As we were talking about earlier, the population of the city. So in this example, it's London, but we could show the same kind of thing for most European cities. Mm-hmm. The data just isn't available for the right-hand part of this. So the population growth of the cities consistently globally is of growth. And so to give that some context, just to paint a picture in your heads, the London grew by about 1 million people in a decade. So that's 100,000 people a year. That's like an Elizabeth line train full of people every week coming into London and not going home.
Elizabeth line a train a week?
Yeah, one a week.
Wow.
Coming in.
For 10 years?
Yeah.
That's cool, isn't it?
It's a lot of people.
Yeah, so they're long trains.
Yeah. And so at the same time, the available industrial land has fallen. So that's obvious because the land is being consumed for other purposes. So low value land gets consumed for higher value land. At the same time, the conversation we were just having about e-commerce, when Amazon started in 90, whatever it was, they might have just sent you a book through the post. And that was an acceptable way of e-commerce working. But today people expect their goods to be delivered very rapidly. Mm-hmm. And if it follows the logic of how that must work, then the people distributing the product and assembling the product need to be as close to the consumers as they can possibly be. There's an obvious ESG point to that about the fuel costs. There's a point about the staff costs. Mm-hmm. And so necessarily industrial occupiers need to be closer to the end user, and yet they're sort of forced out of the land that they have because that's being consumed by other purposes. So London and or other cities' industrial vacancy rate has dropped very rapidly. Quite often the quality of the stock isn't very good either because it's built post-Second World War, so 1950s, 60s, 70s. And so then you see the chart on the right-hand side of this is real rental growth.
Oh, it's after inflation.
So I think that's what it's showing.
Yeah, it does say real.
So I think it's meant to say real.
Yeah, it does.
So then it gets interesting in terms of industrial and logistics. So 5 to 10 years ago, investors would have correctly been very excited about the prospect of what might happen with large format distribution warehouses, also called big box, because that's the supply of that's how the large Amazon formats, it's where they want to be. The chart that's shown on the right hand side is saying whilst distribution warehouses have undoubtedly done well, ordinary London industrial has actually done way better. So it's a much stronger story, and it's a much larger part of the market. It is there are many more occupiers, and one of the consequences of the change in e-commerce and technology, to give you an idea about the technology changes, then if you've seen how an Amazon fulfillment center works, which is these, there's lots of gadgetry, wizardry going on. The robotics that exist called Kiva, they're sometimes called Mexican hats, but they're little machines that sort of scoot around, bringing trolleys around. that business was only bought in about 2014, 2016.
All right.
So that robotics has only been in place for about 10 years.
Okay.
So I've just put a point in your paint a picture in your heads about what does the technology do next?
Yeah.
Because it's highly likely within the period of a lease of a big box format that the robotics changes again and again and again. At the end of the day, this is, like you were hinting at earlier, this is a margin business. And so it's massively in the interest of the retailer and or distributor to reduce their costs if they can, which probably means people if they can do it, or put more throughput through.
Yeah.
So my cheesy line on this is space the final frontier, which sort of connects what we've talked about with regard to retail.
Yeah.
It connects how we think about residential. So it's how people ultimately use the space. And so what we think it does is it doesn't mean the big box distribution warehouses are a bad thing. It just means that they have a technical aspect that could be risky if you have the wrong specification building. One needs to think pretty hard about that. We're still in the growth phase, which will be fine, but you wouldn't want to get caught out by an obsolete shed in the wrong location. And taking that much further down the line, we're obviously as a society investing quite heavily in autonomous vehicles, and it's not outside the realms of possibility within, say, 10 to 20 years that we have some kind of autonomous delivery vehicles. It's technically possible to do it. Whether it's insurable or works fully, one could imagine that the location requirements of big box could change a bit, just because we don't necessarily need to have vehicles working the same way.
Obviously, it will happen in the US first, won't it, because there's more space.
I think it's already happening in China, isn't it? Drone delivery of parcels. I think it's happening in China. Yeah, well, Scottish Mortgages Holdings has got a company involved in it, and I think they're pretty much there.
Physically, it's possible to do it. Whether society is ready for it, whether insurance works in the regulation, but I'm not saying it's there now, and people think I'm being a bit odd about it. But within a 5 to 10 year period, over the period of which you might have had a lease signed, you could see the risk as being quite different.
And the other thing is, if you drive up the M1 or the A1, wherever, there's a lot of big sheds being built. Like you sort of wonder, well, it's not difficult to build a shed, right? You don't necessarily planning fine, but you find a motorway and you're close-ish to a junction. It's sort of supply. Compared and contrast that to building houses in the southeast, it feels a lot easier to build a big shed.
Well, I think
in the Midlands or whatever.
Yeah, I think that the guy Kevin Moffat, who heads Savills Industrial Research, I think would say that actually it is quite hard to get the capacity up, and the occupiers, I think, are largely looking for ever better product. So there is a natural growth, but the problem with that is what I said before. That what does that leave behind? So what you wouldn't want is an inefficient, undersized, poorly utilised industrial building. What do you do with the building that Amazon don't really want anymore?
True.
I think that raises some unusual risks.
Is petrol station usage changing with electrification based on people being stuck there for an hour potentially, or if it's a supercharger, then maybe half an hour? But is there opportunities there?
If my colleague is watching this in feedback, he'll smile at this point. So I've just also written something else, which coincidentally, I wrote something in February called Planes, Trains and Automobiles.
Okay.
And it backs onto some work that I did in the late 1990s about sales densities of retail. So the sales densities of retail and profit densities were then absolutely at their best in transport location destinations, train stations, motorway service stations for the information we had, and the airports. We have been thinking about that a little bit because it would seem we're not an investor in petrol filling stations. I don't think we may have a couple of things, but we're not significantly into that. We just haven't really tend to do it. There is a clear opportunity coming about what it means with EV charging, because
spending more time there.
Yeah, exactly. So I can't remember the stats I wrote, but the time it takes to charge an electric vehicle with a fast charger might be 20-30 minutes. So necessarily, there is dwell time that is created by a modern form of petrol station, an EV charging station or a motorway service station. That market is clearly not very liquid because there aren't very many of them. It's quite specialist, but it could be really good.
Good to see the return of the little chef, couldn't we? people have to stop off and have a bite to eat.
That's taking you back to your childhood.
Probably childhood, yeah. The
Well, but if you remember back in that kind of time, the motorway service stations used to be full of sort of unbrand, sort of the operators branded entities, not the modern franchises. So Julie's Pantry and things like that. If you remember those, but today they are filled with very modern, high quality brands. So whether that's the
Waitrose,
Waitrose, the SSP group,
and
one of the things that happened. So, if I was even more boring than I already am, so a high street shop might be open for something. So it's like a 9 to 6 sort of 6-day trading week. I can't remember the hours. There's maybe 50, 60 hours a week for an average high street. A motorway service station is probably open for nearly 3 times that dwell time.
Course, yeah.
So that opening time, and you might have noticed that they charge marginally higher prices because it's sort of necessity and essential. It's convenience, so that's a very, very small but very interesting part of the market.
Good stuff. And then we'll finish the conversation, I think. We can touch on data centres and a few other bits after, but we're sat in our lovely London office and most of us are here 2 or 3 days a week, but it's fair to say we're not all here 5 days a week. How it still sort of feels to me is that we're still quite fresh out of the pandemic in terms of working habits settling down. You've got some companies, notably Amazon, but also the big banks mandating 5-day-a-week return to work policies. You've got others that are still a bit more relaxed and 3-2, 2-3 split, depending on how it goes. How's the office market in the UK generally, specifically London? How is that sort of settling down in terms of office rents and values, etc., in those markets?
The positive is that relatively little new space has been created. The pandemic caused challenges there. As office occupiers came back, then they have largely, as you've said, they have probably raised their game in terms of their demands of the quality of the product that they have. So people talk about high amenity. That also extends into for the large corporate occupiers particularly, they are very sensitive to the energy efficiency of the buildings. So there are various gradings of those things, but BREEAM excellent or whatever else it might be. That's very, very important to corporate occupiers particularly. And so necessarily with relatively little supply and a renewed demand and renewed demand for a very precise part of the market, so the CBD locations, so it's true for the regional markets as it is for London, then rental growth has come back very strongly.
Right, okay.
Now, the challenge comes with one of the things that's happened over many years. So my colleague Hamish wrote something a couple of years ago called Offices Time to Take Stock. At the same time, the office occupiers are looking for much more flexibility in their buildings. So more demanding, as I said, about the nature of the buildings, but also what that means is more flexibility in the nature of the lease. So back in the day, somebody might have signed a 10, 15, 20-year lease. That's materially less likely to be happening now. And so one of the consequences of that, as companies are not sure as to what their footprint should be, and they've signed shorter leases, then they are moving more frequently.
Right.
And so one of the consequences of that is that this market is clearing much faster than it's ever done before.
Right. That's interesting.
So we see lots of activity, so that's a very positive thing. But of course it's more active because people are signing leases at half the length of what they used to be. So the stat that we look at is called net absorption, which is how much net new space is being taken up, and the net absorption numbers are nowhere near as high as would be implied. So what we think is happening is, and lots of people have talked about this sort of bifurcation of the market, the split between the very best and everything else. And we strongly expect that to continue. So the very best locations in the city, the very best locations in Berkeley Square, Hanover Square, you would expect those rents to be rising rapidly. Now the problem is that most people don't own that. So most people, who are invested in the office market may own something that's sort of a bit more secondary, and that then creates the problem. So the second-hand space, the vacancy rates there are much higher, and that creates a real tension and a difficulty for the investors in those buildings, because what do you do? You know, do you commit to make those buildings better in terms of new capital to try and make them the best they can be? Our concern is that lots of people might try and do that at the same point in time, and they probably won't all be successful. Certainly, if you haven't got the right location, if you haven't got the right flexible building, one needs to be a bit careful there. You could see some things not succeeding.
And I guess as an owner with higher turnover of your tenants, because it's shorter leases, the profitability is just not as good, because you've got vacancy periods. You probably need to do more work to the building as an old tenant leaves, new tenant comes in, they've got different requirements. There's probably a deal done on the first year's rent and all that stuff. So I guess as a landlord, it's not as pretty as it once was.
It's
harder.
It's just harder.
Yeah. Okay.
So I just think one of the comments that my colleagues would talk about is real estate becomes much more operational. So if your client base or your colleagues are thinking about trying to do this themselves, it's actually really hard. If you're thinking about the listed world, you really need to think about the listed specialists or the private market specialists of this, because to have the resources that enable you to have the best insight and be able to reconfigure the buildings, that's more challenging than it's ever been, because effectively the risks around offices have just got greater. It doesn't mean to say that it couldn't be very successful. It just takes a bit more thinking about. Yeah. So one of the strategies that we've been pursuing towards the office market is actually to become a lender to it from our debt team.
I was about to ask about that, but carry on. No, I was going to ask, is there a lot of debt around on these office properties, and is there a risk that if you've got a property in not a primary location, i.e. not in the middle of the city, that you could be left with a building that's not worth anywhere near as much as you thought, and you've got
that's a very high likelihood
of debt? Because we talked about it in the US when Silicon Valley Bank went through last year. The commercial real estate loans market was a potential. Some people said it was the next subprime mortgage debacle, wasn't it? And clearly it wasn't that big a problem.
You had San Francisco office space sort of collapsing 70-80% in places, didn't you?
And so exactly right. So one of the things that we worry about is not so much the UK and European office markets per se, but it's the capital market influences that come from the US, which is a bit like the retail story, because for a North American investor, offices are a real challenge. And that's easily the largest market in the world. And you can see contagion effects. So it's highly likely that there are European, UK banks that have lent into that market that will bring that concern home.
Oh, goody.
Well, and so, but I think that the opportunity there is to, sorry, as you were saying, John, is to force yourself to think, if you're going to participate, is to force yourself into thinking about the best possible part of the office market that is most resilient. The secondary, tertiary could become a real problem for some entities. It's unlikely to be owned by the major listed companies or major private funds, but that market exists, and that could be tricky.
I guess the probably what's really, I guess it's a bigger problem in the US. There's more space, there's more offices, whereas at least in London, space is limited. So at least there's some sort of demand, hopefully. But of course, in London, there's so much commercial property, isn't there, around, and the requirement, as you said, is not there.
Yeah, so I think that there's a capital market influence to this, but that will create lots of opportunity for investors who wish to participate and can participate and recognise the risks of this. I don't really want to talk to any specific submarkets, but some of the submarkets which one might consider prime may have a 10 to 15% vacancy rate. That is nothing like the residential market where we started. Or the prime industrial markets, they have a much lower frictional vacancy rate. It's a simpler model. I think offices, we've certainly seen in North America that the weighting towards offices has, investors have gone much colder towards it, and you would expect that European investors to do the same, to be more cold. If you look to Asia, so we think about, you were asking about return to office. So one of our shareholders is a Korean entity. We speak to them a lot. We speak to our Japanese colleagues a lot. Those markets are actually completely different. There's a return to work is just a given.
Really?
Yeah. So return to the office. and those markets are much more vibrant and vital in terms of offices than the US ones or European.
That's interesting.
I hope our chief executive is listening to this. Take his kids to school. No, it's interesting, and yeah, there are always going to be cultural differences, isn't there? And I guess it's still, my view is it's still panning out. We still don't quite know where we're going to kind of land really with the return to work policies and stuff. And different companies, different sectors, different areas will probably have different mandates. I don't know.
Well, one of the challenges that comes is the office occupiers don't really know how to commit. So your organisation probably would naturally commit to a long lease and the building as good as this. Why wouldn't you do that? Because it's very personal.
Yeah.
But if the business is less like that, one can see again it's dream sequence and a long way out. But the new technologies around AI as an example, you could see that could change the nature of some elements of work.
Yeah.
It's not going to change the relationship work that you do, but for routine data analysis, it could change that. I've seen examples of a potential occupier for one of our office buildings where the entity is a marketing business, where the marketing COO, the COO of the business, isn't really sure where his staff will be, and he's not really sure. If it's about video production, they can do that through some kind of AI now. So he's talking about a 2 or 3 year lease. It's very different.
Copywriters,
it's very different. So it's not all the same. And so, yeah.
Well, that's interesting because our marketing team decided to rewrite our biographies using Copilot. It's fair to say it wasn't great. They did a bit of work, but who knows? Who knows what the future brings? And coming back to the point I said about retail, we are social creatures, so we do want to be around other people. So humans do agglomerate, don't they, and come together, and that the best locations will always have some sort of premium attached to them.
I completely agree. I think that, and you were asking a question about the future of work type thing. I think for to be able to educate younger colleagues, to inform them, to let them know about the shape of the business and so on, being in the office is materially better, but some flexibility of course as well. I completely agree. It's definitely our view that there's something quite special about cities.
When London, if it's not raining, it's beautiful today outside, but when it's sunny and the city's buzzing, it feels great. And I do think the work ethic and your motivation gets picked up, and you're in a nice environment in the office. I think more work gets done. But again, I hope CEOs don't listen to too much.
Any sort of final thoughts? Anything you want to sort of impasse? I mean, anything in the budget that the real estate investors should be keeping an eye out? I mean, on CGT, obviously, we've talked about that already.
So we obviously don't know what's coming in the budget. Perhaps make a comment more generally about the macro point, which we haven't really talked about, but the real estate UK real estate has obviously been impacted by an inflationary environment that's sending interest rates up, and we're clearly past the worst of that. My positive, often say negative things, but my positive is that the interest rate environment we're going into is likely to be very supportive of real estate value, and certainly the interest that we're seeing in the kind of things we do has picked up enormously over the last few weeks. By no means is it all straightforward, but it's certainly very different to the last couple of years. Real assets producing reliable, resilient income streams, they have their place. But I think we've covered quite a lot of the risks that are around that. So one wouldn't want to just buy the sector and hope for the best. That we've covered some things that we'll think about specific areas of the sectors. And maybe the final point, though, if it's about sort of real long-term rental growth, i.e., higher than inflation, that's most likely to be seen in residential for the capacity issues. It's likely to be found in more urban-orientated residential, and the supermarket sector, long leases to great tenants. That's often they're linked to inflation themselves, and some very sort of select offices, but probably not most. But the interest rate environment probably helps. What the Chancellor does in the budget, don't know. They probably need the help of the private sector to get a lot of this modern infrastructure built. So one would expect that to be supportive. Affordable housing, the critical infrastructure of data centers and all that sort of stuff.
Roads, power,
Yeah.
schools, hospitals, the good stuff.
Yeah.
Good. Well, should we leave it there? I've had a really interesting chat, Andrew. Thank you very much indeed.
Pleasure.
It's been great.
Yeah, it's brilliant.
Thank you all for joining us. James and I will be hosting a live webinar on the day after the budget, Thursday the 31st of October, joined by Adam Smith, who is the former Chief Secretary to the Treasury under Jeremy Hunt. So he'll have lots of insight and we'll be able to answer lots of questions about what was in the budget, as well as we'll pick through some of the good news, bad news, gremlins, devil's usually in the detail with these things, and see how kind of markets get on post the announcement, sterling bond yields, interest rate expectations, all that good stuff. I think if you're like the rest of us, you'd probably be quite looking forward to getting it over with and finding out what actually we've got to face with. So do join us. We'll put a link in the email and on our website, etc., for you to sign up. And I think you can watch it on demand afterwards. And we look forward to seeing you then. But in the meantime, Andrew, thank you very much for your time today. It's been an interesting chat. And we'll see you all soon. Thank you very much.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.